Our first question comes from Carl, who wants to know, is memory training part of your practice regimen? It absolutely is. There are a lot of things that you can do to improve your retention skills when it comes to learning new material. The first thing I want to mention before we get into strategies about how to get better with memorization is just the concept of how the human brain actually learns. And there's a German psychologist, guy named Hermann Ebbinghaus, who back in the 19th century pioneered this idea of what is called the forgetting curve. As a matter of fact, let me switch over to the view of this here, okay? Here's the forgetting curve. When you learn something new, after the first day, if you don't review that material, you have forgotten probably more than 60% of what you've learned in that first day. And the longer time goes on, the more you actually forget. Okay, the basic idea here is that people tend to forget information fairly rapidly, especially shortly after learning it. And the rate of forgetting is actually the highest immediately after the process of learning. And this becomes exponential over time. If you go a week without, reviewing something or repeating something, it's pretty much just gone and you're starting from scratch. So the only way to really internalize anything is through repeated exposure and through repetition. Okay, that will help to slow down the rate of forgetfulness. As a matter of fact, take a look at this, all right? For each consecutive repetition, I tend to retain more information. So by the time I get to about the fifth repetition of something, the chances are that I'm going to be able to actively recall it much better. The important thing here with kind of how the forgetting curve works is that for each repetition, you actually want to put a little more space in between those repetitions. In other words, you learn a new chord progression or part of a new song and you repeat it 5 times in a row with no break. That's not of any benefit, okay? You want to repeat something, take a little break, repeat it again. Take a longer break and then repeat it again, and then take an even longer break, okay? In other words, you're trying to space out your repetitions to force your brain to be able to actually recall information over longer periods of time. A couple of basic pieces of advice I would say is don't try to memorize an entire song all at once. Break it down into smaller sections. Also make sure that you're engaging multiple senses. In other words, think about the physical activity as well as the listening activity that goes into learning a new piece of material. Muscle memory and repetition, once again, I wish there was an easier answer other than consistency and patience, but that's really what it comes down to. The one thing that I really try to focus on if I'm learning a new piece of music is what is the relationship of the musical activity to other things that I've already learned? In other words, can I make a connection to familiar patterns that I've seen before? There are certain chord sequences and certain patterns of rhythms or melodies and harmonies that appear in many different songs. A lot of times the way that I can retain so many tunes is that in my brain, they're all very similar in their behavior. If I know how to play chord voicings in many different keys and I know rhythms and melodic patterns in many different keys, I might be able to connect in my brain 30 different songs that most people have no, relationship between listening to them. They think they're all very different sounds, but in my brain, they're actually all kind of the same thing. And this is why learning theory and understanding relationships between notes and chords and harmonies and melodies and rhythms helps you see the bigger picture and also helps you to retain information even more. So if you get frustrated because you can't memorize something the first time around, don't forget about the curse of the forgetting curve. Okay, everybody goes through this. Repetition, consistency, patience, that's the key.